Your Excellency, how did you come to discover the liturgical and doctrinal integrity of the traditional faith amidst the chaos of the post-Vatican II period?
Good question. God led. There's nothing else to say. He was leading. Because I can remember when I arrived at Econe, I had no idea of the difference. There was an old Mass. And there was the difference between the new Mass and the old Mass. No idea at all. So liturgically, I was null and void. There's no other word for it. So, to pick up the story, I was said there was, again, God was leading, because to prepare for being received into the church, I went to Aylesford, where I'd been on a visit previously, because when I originally began to get interested in the Catholic Church, I left this out. I rang the Catholic Introductions Bureau, what I think I found in a telephone book, because I thought, introduction to the faith, sure. Oh, yes, sir, but they're here, we're going to introduce you to young ladies. Ah, for marriage. Ah, okay, I get it. But if you're interested in that, well, you might like Aylesford. So I went to Aylesford. And there, the first time I was there for 3 months before, 3 weeks before entering the church, and 3 weeks after. 3 weeks before, I ran into a young American. This is another tale that I tell frequently, but it's central to my conversion. A big young man, Bob Feeney was his name, from California. I can remember him. I can barely remember him. But anyway, and we were working together on doing some digging for the house. I don't know if you know Aylesford, but it's an open house, kind of, put together by another Irish priest, just after the Second World War, as a central pilgrimage for Londoners, and it was very successful. It still is successful, I do believe. Then I began talking to him. He said he was touring Europe. Oh, yes. And he was touring shrines of Our Lady. Oh, yes. Shrines of apparitions of Our Lady, he said. Apparitions? Not so sure about that. Sounds a bit funny to me, because I'm English and we don't easily believe in things like apparitions. It's a bit for the children, the women. So anyway, yes, he said, and I was at Garabandal, he said, in the north of Spain. I said, oh yes, politely interested. And he said, Our Lady is worried about what's going on in the world. Oh, said I, that's interesting, because I've obviously been worried myself with things that I was running into in education and so on, and the state of the schools and so on and so on. So I said, okay, yes, well, what does she have to say? He said, well, she thinks that humanity is due for a very serious chastisement. Oh, no, that's sort of my water to my mill. So I thought, oh, yes? And he said, well, if you're interested, he said, there's a book about it in the little library of the shrine here, and you can find that book and read it. So I went pretty fast and found that book. I think the author is Sanchez Venturi Pascual, and somebody was mentioning the book is back in print, or it's again in circulation. I think it's very good. It's very factual. The apparitions had come to an end in 1965, which was quite recent. And at first, when he said, Bob Feeney said that he'd run into some recent apparitions of Our Lady, my reaction, without saying so, was pull the other leg. I mean, this is baby stuff. But then when he said that she's worried about what's going on in the world, then I perked up my ears. And then I read the book. I was convinced straight away. because the book is a factual account of some 2,000 apparitions spread over 5 years to 4 mountain girls in the north of Spain. And it convinced me straight away, because the girls were running up and down, backwards or forwards, on these mountainous paths without falling. They might crash to the ground, but their skirts would never be indecent, for instance, and so on and so on. All of these details. But the evidence was, for me, coming straight to it without any prejudice, the evidence was absolutely convincing. And I believed in Garabandal ever since, and I believe in it to this day. But it had a very important effect. It didn't convert me, because I was already going to enter the church so Garabandal didn't convert. But what it did do, because I read all other books about other apparitions of Our Lady in the little library, Lourdes, Fatima, of course, Rue du Bac in Paris, 1830, La Salle, 1846, Pontmain, 1870, Rue du Bac, I messed up, Rue du Bac, 1830. There's half a dozen apparitions and a couple in Belgium in the 1930s, Borin, Banner. And it's all the same, essentially the same line. Our Lady concerned for the salvation of souls, worried about the way the world's going, and trying to get her message, through to human beings, the message of the gravity of the situation and the gravity of their danger, of their peril. So, and warning about the way the whole world is going. That made a lot of sense to me. So I was received into the church by Father Flanagan, and then I spent another 3 weeks at Aylesford preparing to make a journey to the various shrines of Our Lady in Europe, because she made sense. I then filled a rucksack and went took a train to France, and began with the Rue du Bac in Paris in 1830, where Our Lady appeared to St. Catherine Labouré in 1830. Then I went down south to Lourdes, and I stopped over to visit Malcolm Muggeridge, who was holidaying down in the south of France, where Graham Greene called by. That's another sad character, another grey character. Grey, trying to escape from greyness and turning to the Catholic faith, but I don't think he put his weight on it. I don't think he stayed committed to it. I don't think. Too preoccupied with too happy with his modern problems. That was my impression of Graham Greene. Too happy with his problems to want to really get out of them, who would really want the solution. But he was a good friend with Malcolm Muggeridge, and he called, and I got to know him very briefly. A sad man, I found. Anyway, Malcolm Muggeridge was happy to receive me as usual, and I went on my way to the shrines. I went to Lourdes. I went to where she appeared in 1856. I stopped over at St. Ignatius, because that was another character who had appealed to me. St. Ignatius and his exercises. I visited Manresa, where there was another hook with my past, because there's the famous cave where he spent 10 months before making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and where he received the exercises from the Mother of God, says the Church. And there's this cave where he lived for that while. And now there's an audio machine playing a little script about the cave and who are the features and so on and so on. So I put my coin in this machine, and it begins da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Beethoven was my God. Before God was my God, please God forgive me, before God was my God, Beethoven was my God. And I still love him very much. He's my John Lennon. Beethoven is my John Lennon. So I recognize Beethoven, and somebody else is connecting Beethoven with the exercises, or the drama of Beethoven with the drama of the exercises, which is interesting. So I visited the cave later, maybe 20, 30 years later, I can't remember exactly. There was no longer the machine nor Beethoven there, so I don't know what happened. Then I visited, I went to Fatima. But on the way to Fatima, I stopped off at Garabandal. Garabandal, I met one of the main one of the four mountain girls called Conchita, who was still living there at the time. I'd had a brief chat with her at one stage. She was very kind. She must have been very much vexed by all of the visitors wanting to talk to her. But she was there, and I met her also later in New York. But there, in the village, I think I spent 2 weeks, there were a lot of books about left by previous pilgrims about other places of pilgrimage, other apparitions in Germany, in Austria, in Italy. So I picked up, filled my rucksack with books on other apparitions, began reading them all, went over to Fatima, which was obviously an important place, and I filled my head with apparitions because they all addressed my particular combined problem, which was the need of the classical Catholicism as against the modernized Catholicism, which made no sense to me. But my problem, the problem with which I had come to the Catholic Church, was the problem that was solved by the old religion, but not by the new religion. I mean, I didn't know where it was all coming from. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what the new difference was between the two religions. I was a dopey Joe. I really knew very little. So, okay. So, but Our Lady of the Apparitions, in a manner of speaking, gave me an orientation. That is to say, I got back to England, and I went to see some of the priests who'd been so good to me on my way, who'd tolerated this self-centered young man, or whatever he was, and done their best for him. And I said, "Oh, Father, I've just been to Europe." "Yes." "And I've been visiting scenes of apparitions." "Yes." "And Father, she's speaking about problems of today, and she's really concerned about what's going on in the world." "Yes." "Dear boy, how long have you been converted?" "Oh, Father, 3 months." "Yes. Don't worry. Take it easy." So all of these good priests, they were not responding to Our Lady's urgency about what's going on in the world. Whereas I sense this urgency and sense that the old religion deals with it and the new religion doesn't. And in fact, what was happening was I was running into the post-Vatican Church. These good priests were clinging hold of the true religion, but they were losing grip on the modern world. They did not hold both ends of the chain. They were dropping one end because the gulf is so different. Although some of those priests were inclining to go with Teilhard de Chardin and the modern world, but they would drop the old religion. So the combination of holding the old religion and holding the grave problem of the modern world was Our Lady of Apparitions. So from then on, I put a slight sort of minus mark against these good priests. They're decent, they're kind, they've got the old faith, but they're not interested enough, for my money, in what's going on in the modern world. So I had they say in French, you put a flat, mettre un bémol. I had a reservation with these good priests from then on. So there were one or two friends who mentioned Econe and Archbishop Lefebvre, because when I talked about the religion, faith with friends and so on, I would say that, these priests, Our Lady of Apparitions, I would sort of light up. Many of them would be dubious about apparitions, but there were one or two who said, you should go to visit Econe, meet Archbishop Lefebvre. So that was the next thing I did. I got back to England, and then a little while after that, I filled the rucksack again and went down to visit Econe. Actually, somebody told me to meet an American priest, a good traditional American priest, Father Urban Snyder, who was staying at Econe. So the reason, my main reason for my first main reason for visiting Econe was to meet Father Snyder. But there I did, in fact, also meet the Archbishop. I didn't even stay overnight in the seminary because I didn't want to burden I stayed in a local hotel. I met the Archbishop briefly. He was very kind and very affable and he offered the night. I said, well, no, I'm not going to go. And I went off to this little hotel and I read I can remember I read another article of the Summa, taking notes. And those notes were very useful later. And the introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas was obviously providential by the use that I could make of it later, but we'll come to that. So that was my first meeting with the Archbishop. Then I went down to San Damiano, which is a famous modern site of apparitions of Our Lady, I think in the 1960s. And the Mama Rosa was the visionary who received the messages of Our Lady. Then I visited shrines, a shrine in Austria, a shrine one or two shrines in Germany. And Our Lady was appearing all over at different times, and always with the same concern for the way mankind is going, and with the same concern for her divine Son, of course, and for the true religion, the true church. All of it made sense, made complete sense, whereas these decent priests no longer made complete sense. So I was a sitting duck for another reason which came, I can't remember when or why. I was all the time now studying an article a day, because you've got to study St. Thomas. You can't read him like a detective novel, that's ridiculous. You've got to study it, because the thinkage is so dense that to make sure you've got it, you've just got to take your time. I would take 3/4 of an hour of an article, sometimes a little less, but often rather more. So I worked my way steadily through easily most of the first part of the 4 parts of the Summa, the Prima Seconda, the Seconda Secondi, and the Tertia. And it always was making sense. He's thoroughly logical. He's totally objective. No emotion, no feeling, what you get in St. Augustine, together with the thinkage. Augustine is thinkage and feeling, head and heart. The heart is not evident in St. Thomas Aquinas. It's there, but it's not evident. It's strictly left aside while he thrashes out with fierce and strong syllogisms the truth about the. So spiritual things are no longer just sweet and sentimental, which is the Anglican vision of religion. They are as tough as nails, and you've got to sit down for 3/4 of an hour at a time to work it out. It's so tough. So that was what I was feeding on, kind of. And then I forget how and I forget when, but I came back a second time to visit Econe. I forget, oh gosh, I'm losing details, but it doesn't matter. I'd go on forever if I gave all the details. And the second time, I think I was already interested in entering Econe. But I was going by the guidance of Father Flanagan, because I was visiting shrines, and again, it was not going anywhere, or apparently going nowhere. So after the next, at least another year and a half, I visited San Damiano, went to see Mama Rosa, and I said to her what state I was. Possibility of a vocation, but no cogs that gripped. Just a sort of vague idea that might be what. Because, I'm sorry, I'll backtrack again. When I left Father Flanagan's, after being received into the church with the lad there, he was there also at my reception. When I left, he said, "You young man, you should be a priest." I said, "Wait a moment, Father, wait a moment, go easy. So I did not immediately become a priest. I didn't immediately try. But I'd spent nearly 2 years traveling, visiting shrines, studying the Summa, meeting Catholics. So at the end of that 10 months, I got restless. And when I visited San Damiano again, Mama Rosa said, I went to see Mama Rosa, and she said to me, who is your spiritual director? And I said, well, I guess Father Flanagan. So she said, go and see him. So that was pretty sound advice. Classic advice, sound advice. So I went to see Father Flanagan again. He said, what are you doing, young man? This is now 20 months after last seeing him. What are you doing with yourself? Father, I'm traveling around and visiting shrines. What are you doing? You know, that's the same situation. Are you working? No, Father, no. Well, you should be working. So what were you doing when you were working? I was teaching in the school. Okay, picks up the telephone to the nearest public school, which is in Eastbourne. He says, have you got a vacancy for a young man that can teach languages? By Providence, there was one of the teachers was a cricketer who wanted to get off for the summer, cricket. So I could take his place. So I occupied his flat and filled his place for a few months. And during that time, Father Flanagan sent me firstly to the priests, a meeting of young men with possible vocations for the priesthood at Wantage Seminary, which is near Guildford. A very handsome building, and functioning still, in the wake of Vatican II, functioning still but dying. And it's just dead. It's just being closed. So we had this meeting. It was from sort of Friday evening to Sunday afternoon. There were 3 examiners, a woman, a layman, and a priest. And there was an interview with each of these, and then there was a collective interview. So, which of the 3 do you think asked the question about celibacy? Guess. You got it. You got it. Could you endure celibacy? I almost fell off my chair. And since I fell off she repeated, could you endure celibacy? So I stammered some answer. I can't remember what I said. When I got back after, then there were the other 2 interviews, and then there was the group interview, which is apparently just like modern industry. Modern industry gets a bunch of young men in, and then it makes them join in a discussion with some, monitor the discussion, and then they throw some red meat in among the dogs, and the dogs are going to bite and bark, and the monitor realizes what biting and barking there is in each of the dogs. So that's apparently modern industry's way of examining candidates. So here he was in the church. What subject would you like to discuss? So I said, Garabandal. Oh, obviously there was a slight freeze. Most people knew nothing about it. Those who knew anything about it, it's a discouraged and discredited apparition. Because, I don't know if you know the details, but there were 2 formal messages, one at the beginning in 61, the second formal message in 65. First formal message, the cup, amongst other things, is quite short, but amongst other things, the cup is filling up. 65 message, the cup is flowing over at each end of Vatican II. How could 4 mountain girls know what's going on in Vatican II? They got no idea about it. So, but Our Lady is obviously trying to doing what she can to counter Vatican II. So she said in the second of these messages, she said, many cardinals, bishops and priests are on the road to perdition, and they are taking many souls with them. So you can imagine the churchmen are not too happy about Our Lady of Garabandal. They're taking souls to hell, which of course they are. But they didn't like being told that. So Garabandal is thoroughly discredited. So I said, I'd like to talk about Garabandal. So I talked about Garabandal, and the monitor realized that I was off on apparitions. So the final decision of Bishop Arden, of Arden and the Diocese of Ardwell and Brighton, Arundel and Brighton. The bishop, I forget his name, Bishop Bowen, as it was at that time, of Arundel and Brighton, wrote, or the rector of the seminary, I forget. Thank you, but no thank you. So I was out on the pavement again. So I went back to Father Flanagan with my tail between my legs, and he said, well, I've been thinking with... he was furious when he learned about the woman judging priestly vocations. He was furious. And he sat down at his old-fashioned typewriter and pounded out a blast to the bishop. I don't think it made any difference, but anyway, that was Father Flanagan. And it wasn't the classic way of doing things in the church, and he didn't like it. So then Father Flanagan said, well, I've been talking with Father Watmore in the parish just next door, and we've had a thought, maybe you could try the London Oratory, because they take Oxbridge graduates, they take people who are, self-subsistent, who can look after themselves in that respect. You fit the bill in many ways, okay, so you try there. So I said, okay, so I went to try at the London Oratory. And there were 3 of us postulants, I remember, and we were being given some preliminary lessons in Scripture, and it was an old and decent priest who came up with some more or less modern commentary. And I would say, sort of, Father, can't we read St. Augustine on these questions? I knew better than I could show that I was I didn't mean to, but I was trying to know better than who the house thought was good to teach us some Scripture, or something about Scripture. So at the end of a month there, I remember it was Father Charles Napier was what do they call him at the rectory, at the oratory? Provost. Charles Napier was the provost. And he sat me down and, thank you, but no thank you. So I was out on the pavement again. So I went down, I slunk down to Polegate again, down in Sussex. I told Father Flanagan, I'm out on the pavement again. Do you really think I have a vocation? He said, young man, if you can't keep your big mouth shut, there's only one place for you, and that's Econe. I said, what's Econe? He said, well, he explained a bit. He didn't agree with Archbishop Lefebvre. In fact, he'd stood him up at a meeting where he was scheduled to meet Archbishop Lefebvre because Archbishop Lefebvre was against the Pope. Father Flanagan was one of those many priests. The bishops are terrible, all of them are terrible, but the Pope can do no wrong. So the Archbishop was against the Pope. He refused to see the Archbishop. But in desperation, he was willing to send me over to Switzerland, to the seminary of the Archbishop. So I got Father Paul Morgan, who was by then ordained a priest of the Society in England, to come down and meet Father Flanagan. They would discuss the canonical question, because I thought that Archbishop Lefebvre was canonically beyond the pale. So Father Paul Morgan, Peter Morgan discussed with Father Flanagan, but Father Flanagan was a professional canon lawyer, so Father Flanagan kind of won the debate, so to speak, even defending Archbishop Lefebvre, with whom he did not agree. Anyway, so I went down to Econe. And from the moment I arrived in Econe in young lay clothes and kind of Sherlock Holmes clothing, it seemed. That was the impression made on the French seminarians. I stayed at Econe from then on. That was the end of 1972.
Could you tell us a little bit about your priestly formation at Econe? And how did various true shepherds such as Archbishop Lefebvre and Father Barriel shape your priesthood?
Since I already had a degree in Latin and Greek, since I already had a formation in Latin and Greek and a knowledge of French, I was fluent in French, they spared me and a humanist education. They cut off a year of the 4-year formation, so of the 5-year formation, so I only did 4 years. Already the Archbishop cut it from 6 to 5 years, simply in order to get priests out on the road who would say the old Mass and uphold the church. Because the Archbishop was convinced, he was convinced that if he had to put the new Mass in the seminary, he could put the key in the door a few months later. He was convinced the new Mass was not workable for the faith. And so he from the beginning, he stuck to the old Mass at the seminary. I knew nothing about the difference. I'd been regularly to the new Mass in the parish in England. I was somewhat familiar with the new Mass, but I had no idea of the old Mass. So I was experiencing the old Mass for the first time soon after I arrived. I knew nothing about tradition, or the difference between tradition and the new religion. Nothing.
What were your first impressions of the old Mass?
Not particular. Honestly, nothing particular. I didn't go into ecstasy or anything like that because it's not English. So I settled in Econe. I did 4 years there, studying on my own at the same time, all the time, an article a day of St. Thomas, which stood me in very good stead, because when I was ordained in the hot summer of 1976, which was the first large batch of new priests from under the Archbishop. He had ordained 3 in the summer of 1975, one of whom was Bishop Tissier, now a bishop of the Society, a good man. I remember the 2 others, Bishop Sanborn in the United States, who's now a rigid sedevacantist, a bit too rigid for my taste. And then a Pierre Blin, who was French, but who left the Society, maybe after a year, because the great temptation was always to go back to the official church, where Econe seminarians were usually welcomed with open arms, because the novice order bishop would know that they'd received a good formation in Econe. St. Thomas Aquinas and Canon Law, church history. You know, the Archbishop did what he could with what was in effect a ragbag of professors, but they were the only ones that came to help him. Some were very good, like the Shaman Berto. Others sat up on the dais and liked talking about things they liked talking about to a more or less captive audience. So, they're old men liking to talk. Old men liking to talk, bit familiar? So I was ordained in 1976 when there was a tremendous publicity flurry all over the newspapers because of the novelty and of the first schism in the church since, as it seemed, a schism, since many, many years, a few centuries, in fact. So it was news, and it was news. And immediately afterwards, the Archbishop was suspended. I think all of us were suspended. The validity of our orders was recognized by Rome. We were valid priests, but we were suspended. We should have stopped acting as priests. But the Archbishop just went ahead. He said, this suspension is based on the suspension of the seminary back in 1975. That was unjust, he said, because I was refused an audience in Rome to defend myself. The condemnation was without a hearing. It's an invalid condemnation. The Archbishop knew canon law very well, and therefore he refused the suspension of the Society. He refused the suspension of himself and the priests. So I blithely followed the Archbishop. I trusted the Archbishop completely. Over 4 years, getting to know him, because he gave a lot of lectures to seminarians. I trusted him. I trusted his judgment. I trusted his wisdom. I trusted his sanctity. He was the church as far as I was concerned, and I don't reckon I made a mistake. So after that, I did a first year. Your script is a little inaccurate, but it doesn't matter. It's not important. I did a first year teaching from then on, until I was kicked out of the Society, I was all the time in seminaries, teaching. So I was never in a society parish or society priory. So I was always sort of up in the clouds somewhere. But teaching is, Americans would say, teaching is my bag. So I was very happy doing that. And I was teaching 1 year in the German-speaking seminary. I was then teaching 5 years in Econe, the French-speaking seminary. I was then teaching 15 years in the American seminary, and then finally 5 years in the Spanish seminary, 4 different language seminaries of the society. So I was rector in America and in the Argentine. So I had a career teaching. And I was also giving the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius a good deal of this time, especially towards the beginning, because I did the exercises myself when I entered Econe, the 30-day exercises, partly because of my respect for St. Ignatius. Again, absolutely instinctive, nothing that I could credit myself with. And I learned from an old priest who was one of the good teachers at the seminary, Father Bariel, formed by Jesuits, by an ex-Jesuit. That's another interesting story. Father Vallet. He was a parish priest, basically. But then he joined this little society to preach the exercises, because he himself, Father Bariel, did the exercises, was absolutely enthusiastic, and from then on preached the exercises until the end of his days. At the end of his days, he was an old man, and during giving an exercise, he would have a bottle of Coca-Cola on the table, and he would sort of fall asleep. Then he'd wake up again, take a swig of Coca-Cola, and pick up again exactly where he left off. But he couldn't stop preaching the exercises until he died. A great man, and a great support of Archbishop Lefebvre. And so Archbishop Lefebvre recognized that he was a great former of priests, a great former of seminarians, which is true, very true. But the intellectuals didn't care for him. He was too genuine, too down to earth, too real. The intellectuals don't always like reality. So I began teaching in the German-speaking seminary. That was just a year. Then 5 years at Econe, and that's where the St. Thomas Aquinas came in, because thanks to my own studying of my providential studying of St. Thomas Aquinas, I was able to give. I'd never done any theology in any university. God forbid. You can imagine what would have happened if I'd done that. But Almighty God had put me to his university, and I had been introduced providentially to St. Thomas Aquinas, had read and looked thoroughly at quite a lot of St. Thomas Aquinas by then. And from that, I was able to teach theology and philosophy to the seminarians at Econe. And they got from me, I would venture to say, pretty solid St. Thomas Aquinas, which of course was exactly what seminarians need, what good seminarians need. And none of the modernist nonsense, none of it, not a shadow of it, not a shadow of it. And I can remember, I rarely went to see the Archbishop. Apparently he liked visiting seminaries to visit him, but I didn't know that. Otherwise I would have visited him much more often. But I went 2 or 3 times only to see him in his study when I was a seminarian. His door was always open. You were always welcome. And this was in 1975, when the seminary took another body blow, when the suspension by Rome, or by the local diocese, that had granted the seminary its original permission, took that permission back, or pretended to take it back, claimed to take it back. Again, the Archbishop said, this is not canonical, this is not genuine, this is not the real thing. And so the Archbishop continued blithely on. And I remember a tremendous evening where he said to the seminaries, I will not abandon you. I'm not going to abandon you. You needn't be afraid of me not ordaining you. If you stay at the seminary and do what you're meant to do at the seminary, I will ordain you year by year. And then the Archbishop was quite funny, because in the chapel, the deacons would be seated with the ones next for the priest. The junior seminaries would be right up front, and the senior seminaries would be right at the back, just in front of the Archbishop and the professors. And the Archbishop said that, when he was getting older, if he would start coughing in the chapel, the deacons due to be ordained next would look nervously around to see if he was not going to kick the bucket or die. He was funny. The Archbishop was funny. He was always dignified. His humour was dignified, but he was funny. He had a genuine sense of humour. So, I spent 1 year in Germany, then 5 years in Econe, where I was able to teach. I could hold my own as a professor with little experience in seminaries. But anyway, it was an improvisation with the materials he had at hand. Yeah. And in 1975, I can remember at least 3 or 4 professors quit under the hammer blow of Rome, because they had too much respect for Rome still. And the result was the Archbishop had to throw his own juveniles into the breach. Bishop Tisci immediately began teaching in 75, and I was brought back to Econe in 77, 1 year after I'd been ordained, with a year of teaching in Germanic land, at the eastern end of Switzerland. And then I remember that mind goes blank. I went to see the Archbishop, and I said, Your Excellency, we look like losing 3 or 4 professors. Implied, what are you going to do? What? And he, in his very quiet way, he said, well, if we don't have professors, the seminarians will simply have to learn from the books. No question of deviating in order to pick up some modernist professors or to fill the ranks at all costs. No question. The question is, how are these seminaries going to be formed in the truth in order to be proper priests? That was his only concern. The rest, actually, he managed to put together a staff again. Then in 77, there was another crisis towards the beginning of the school year. I was ready to teach for a second year in German land, but I was hauled back to France, to Econe, because of a crisis, and another 3 professors had run away. Oh, it was terrible. I then taught for 5 years at Econe, which I enjoyed. There were serious tensions inside the seminary. 73, 75, 77, a crisis on the left, a lot of seminarians going off back to the new church. In 79, a Sedivacantis crisis, because Sedivacantis was arising at that time. So the people who believe that the Pope is not Pope and that the church is without Pope, the Archbishop never accepted that. He considered it, but he never accepted it. But in 79, there was again a serious crisis. But the crises were very formative for the seminarians. You know, when there's a crisis and there's a bunch of seminarians fly away, you've got to make up your mind why you're going to stay, if you're going to stay, and why you're going to stay. So it's very formative. So, you know, the devil struck the seminary again and again, heavy blows. And the Archbishop was absolutely serene. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he never wavered. He just continued quietly on. I go to him, Your Excellency, half the professors are going to disappear. Well, if we don't have professors, we'll have to learn from the books. I remember it so well. And no fuss, no anxiety. Great man. So there were tensions inside the seminary. I was not popular on the staff. There were already liberals preparing to redirect the society as soon as the old man would give way. Excuse me, talking like that of the Archbishop. But that's really what it was. So in 1982, that was 5 years after 77, I was moved over to the United States, well away from Econe, because The other professors didn't want me. They were glad to see the last of me. I was an enfant terrible. I didn't join the club. I wasn't very liberal. No credit to me, again, that's Almighty God's doing. But I wasn't very liberal. I understood the Archbishop. He was holding to the true religion while being well aware of what was going on in the world and not wanting to hide his head in the sand and not hiding in the old religion because it's so much more pleasant than the modern world. He was right up to date with what was going on in the church, and he was taking his position against the rest of the church. It was incredible. It was one man Athanasius against the world. No other bishop would stand by him. No other bishop could see things the same way. No other bishop saw the need and the urgency as clearly as he did. I could see it. In my non-Catholic way, I could see it. But the integration with with the old Mass and with Catholic doctrine and with the integration of my own Catholicism, my quasi-invented Catholicism, and the Catholicism of the true Church, it made itself year by year. So 76, he could trust in me, and he ordained me. And there were, I think, 14 of us ordained, 12 of the society and 2 outside the society. Within a year or two, 6 of the 12 had already left the society, mostly to go back to the mainstream church. They could see, they had with this respect that all of the youngsters had for authority. But what was really going on was that they were boys reared, there were no girls. There were boys in the seminary who had been born and bred in the 40s and 50s, before the 60s. So they knew, they had some sense in their homes, especially of the order of the world before Vatican II. And what they were looking for after, when they thought they had a vocation, and many of them certainly did have a vocation, if not all, practically all of them, many of them were looked for a continuation of the 1950s. What they were looking for was a seminary of the 1950s. Now, most of the seminaries of the 1950s had been shut down, including, for instance, well, not shut down, but completely changed course, like Wonosh. So they couldn't go to those seminaries, but they found Archbishop Lefebvre, and they came to his seminary. But then when the hammer blows kept coming down, and when the difference between Archbishop Lefebvre and the modern world became more and more clear, and the modern church, they were waiting for the time when they would be able to. They loved the Archbishop. We all followed him, like I always say, a line of 8 little ducklings behind Mother Duck on the pond. You know what it's like? And that's what we little seminarians were like behind the Archbishop. He was a bewitching figure, a magnetic figure, a great man, a great churchman, a great man of God. So, and he leant on God, which is what was his strength. So, the boys of the 1950s were looking for remaking the 1950s or continuing the 1950s. The Archbishop wasn't looking for continuing the 1950s. He was very much a great missionary priest of the 1950s, a great missionary bishop of the 1950s. He was a trusted confidant of Pius XII. And wrote one of Pius XII's encyclicals on the missions about, priests come out to Africa because we need you in Africa, and so on. So the Archbishop was right at the top of the church of the 1950s, a great churchman, but he wasn't of the 1950s because when the 1960s happened, he began the council in 62 in lockstep with his fellow bishops. But when he realized what his fellow bishops were up to, which was changing the religion, changing the God-centered religion for the man-centered religion, the new religion. And it was a war of religions, a real war of religions, a war between the old world and the new world. So when he realized what was going on at the council, he unlocked with his colleagues and began criticizing, began saying, and that's that volume of his which appeared, A Bishop Speaks. And he began visiting France and visiting Catholics in distress, because some of them were already in serious distress with what was going on at the head of the church with Paul VI, and now with the whole council. And he began giving lectures, and that's when then there's the drama of how he founded the Seminary of Econe in 1970. That's another story. But if I told you all the stories, we would be here until Saturday. So instead, he was head of the Holy Ghost Fathers. In 1968, he resigned from the Holy Ghost Fathers because the congregation was not going to follow him. There was a general meeting at the top of the congregation, and it was clear that he was due for a second term of 6 years to fulfill his proper term of 12 years. But he realized that they were not going to follow him, so he resigned. He said, boys, do your thing, but I can't stay at the head of you. And he found himself a little flat in Rome with a good old sister to look after him. And he was going to go out to grass as an old war horse, which he had every right to do. He had church medals all over his chest as a great bishop who opened up a dozen dioceses, new dioceses, or founded, built, created more than a dozen. It was maybe as much as 19 new. I forget the figure, but he created a large number of new dioceses. He was a tremendous builder of the church, and flourished under Pope Pius XII. But then came John the 23rd, and he was still in the Holy Ghost Fathers. He told a story about another story about John the 23rd. John the 23rd was a modernist and was not on the same wavelength as the Archbishop, but wanted to put pressure on the Archbishop to do this or that or the other. And the Archbishop said no, because it was... And then the answer of John the 23rd was, what about that cardinal's hat, Your Excellency? Trying to bribe the Archbishop with the cardinal's hat. And the Archbishop was funny, he said, the hat proved to be a flying saucer. He never got the cardinal's hat because he was out of step with the mainstream church, absolutely out of step. He came under the hammer from Paul VI, he founded the seminary in 1970. He founded it with the Old Mass. He had a small group of seminarians to begin with, and at the end of that year, most of them flew away again. But there were two who persuaded him to continue. One of them was Bishop Tissier, and the other was Father Alagna, who's died since. Died a couple of years ago. Good man, I liked him a lot. But the Archbishop continued. And the next year, there was a good crowd of seminarians, and from then on, the seminary went from strength to strength. 1974, he came particularly, there was a commission, the Rome waited for his thing to fail. And when it didn't fail, but on the contrary, succeeded very well, then then Rome sent a couple of Belgian high-up prelates to inspect the seminary. The Archbishop greeted them openly. I can remember that. I'm boasting now. But when it came to the seminarians meeting the visitors from Rome, he sent me first, because I was a graduate, a university graduate, a convert, a university graduate, and here was I in the seminary and flourishing at the seminary. Again, no credit, no glory to me, but I was flourishing at the seminary. I was very happy and learning. So he sent me to be one of the first seminarians to meet these two. And they talked to me and I talked to them. I can't remember anything they said. But one of them said to one seminarian, the ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ, 40 days after Easter, well, you don't have to believe in that. The Archbishop was furious when he heard that. High up representatives from Rome telling seminarians that they needn't believe dogmas of the faith. And that was the cause of his famous declaration in 1974, the November 1974, We believe in the Rome of all time. We don't believe in neoliberal, neo-modernist, neo-Protestant Rome. We want to die Protestants. You know the declaration, probably. That was the occasion, that famous declaration, which was the charter of tradition. 75, the reporters go back to Rome, and we don't know what they said. But then Rome, the archbishop was summoned to Rome, and he faced a committee of 3 cardinals who quizzed him. And the archbishop said, I think he said to them, or to some other cardinal at some other point, I should be sitting where you are, I should be quizzing you, not you quizzing me. The archbishop won't have said that in an aggressive way, but in a substantial way, because it was substantially true. He was from then on, he had several encounters with Roman officials, and every time they behaved with the new religion as though they were cocks of the dung heap, when it's really the archbishop who should have been sitting in the inquisitor seat and inquisiting them on their false new religion. And he said that to them. He would say that and back it up with the fact that, objectively, the true religion was being replaced, was being kicked out, was being trampled on, was being thrown away by heresy. Heresy. New religion is heretical. Well, the archbishop was very clever, was very accurate. He was very realistic. And he said, the new religion is not always heretical, but it comes from heresy and it leads to heresy, which is absolutely accurate. And therefore, it's not to be accepted. Even if it's not always openly heretical itself, it comes from heresy, it leads to heresy, Schluss, finish, over. So, in 74, in 75, he was summoned down to Rome. He was up against a kangaroo court, as he said. He said, the communists would have treated me better. They would not understand or listen to what he said. And they issued a kind of another condemnation. Well, that was what they issued after that was the suspension of the society. And the archbishop said, there's no foundation for this. He appealed against it, and Cardinal Vio, who was very high up next to Paul VI, said, no, you do not hear this case. The tribunal, the Roman tribunal, are fit to hear the case. You do not hear this case. The archbishop said, I'm not given a hearing. This is not valid. This is simply not valid. This is not just. This is not Catholic. This is not the true church. I'm paying no attention. Same thing when he was come under the hammer again in 76 with a personal suspension, together with the suspension of all the priests he just ordained. He continued serenely ahead, and it was very easy. All I can say is it was very easy to follow him. I followed him, quite simply. And then I was off to, he sent me off to Germany firstly, because they needed a professor. He had just opened a seminary in German-speaking territory in East Switzerland. I did a year there, and then was summoned in 77 back because of the crisis in Econe. Seminarians and professors flying away. We just about managed to patch together a staff with Bishop Tissier and a few other oldsters. Shannon Bertha was a great help. He was a very good professor, formed by the Dominicans in St. Thomas Aquinas in Fribourg, when the Dominicans were still sane. And so things went on, but I was not popular with the other professors. I think I can say with most of them, if not all of them. I was a little bit popular with some seminarians, not all of them. So, come 82, there's a need in the United States, and the Archbishop sends me over there and brings in some other of his, by now his priests are accumulating, he brings in some other of his priests to fill the gaps in the staff, and the teaching goes on at Econe. I'm over in the United States. I was not unhappy to be sent over to the United States. I remember saying on the plane to two priests now dead, Father Chicard and Father Dolan. Father Dolan, Bishop Dolan died just recently. Father Chicard had died about a year ago, I guess. I got on perfectly well with both of them. Both of them became sedevacantists. I blended into the seminary of the Society in the United States, which was then in Connecticut. And I was back to teaching, fine, no problem. But again, this time, the other priests in the seminary were not too happy with yours truly, because yours truly was too much on the left, no longer too much on the right, relative to the priests in Econe, but too much on the left relative to the sedevacantists teaching at the Archbishop Seminary in the United States. So, come spring of 1983, and the Archbishop's priests in the United States, in the Northern District and in the seminary, decide to break with him, or to take a position which the Archbishop had to break with. So they blamed the Archbishop for throwing them out. He blamed them for taking a position which he could only throw out. Take your pick. Any case, the priests were kicked out, and that was 9 priests, 5 in the district, and another 4 the Archbishop ordained. Oh my! It was another drama. The devil was hammered Econe. He hammered what was it then? Connecticut. He hammered the seminary in the Argentine. The devil was obviously very unhappy with all the seminaries of the Archbishop, but the Archbishop's seminary survived. His work survived. The society survived, because of his sanctity, because of his wisdom, because of his example, and because of his forming all of these young priests in the truth, which the youngsters got hold of by themselves. Once the Archbishop put in front of them at his seminaries, they were able to get hold of the truth and stand on their own feet in line behind the Archbishop. We all lined up behind the Archbishop, but then in 1991, no, we come to 1988, the consecrations. That's still on the program. So what happened to the consecrations? Well, I was off in the United States in 82. I was away from Econe. I was away from the drama in Europe. I didn't know all that. I was no longer directly involved over in Europe, but I was over in the United States. The Archbishop followed serenely on his path, and he gathered more and more. He ordained more and more priests. He gathered more and more faithful following him in the outrider priories which he was founding with his young priests. And so there was a whole movement building all over the world. The Archbishop himself, like a good missionary, he would travel himself all over the world to visit and encourage Catholics. I remember going down with him to South Africa in 1981. It was a great privilege. And we visited groups that I'd set up a couple of previous years amongst the South African Catholics. And everywhere in the world there was this reaction in favor of the old religion, puzzlement and distress at the new religion, and the Archbishop was the natural solution. And he would go and give conferences and reassure them, and inevitably, wherever he went, things would flourish, tradition would flourish behind him. He was building tradition all over the world. Rome can't have been happy with this. This is tradition, the old religion, which has to be stamped out, because by a man like Paul VI, because Paul VI is set heart and soul upon reconciling the Catholic Church with the modern world. He's going to put them together. Which you may remember, the lad that went ahead of me in the church in Polegate, and who is now, I said to you, a novice order bishop. He said he was happy with this reconciliation, but in fact, the two, what is at stake, you cannot reconcile. You can't mix oil and water. You can shake them furiously in one bottle together, but the moment you stop shaking, the water. The oil rises and the water falls, and they just separate quite neatly. The new religion, the old religion, are at loggerheads, they're at war. There's no other way of putting it. That's the reality of the content of the two religions. One is centered on God and the other is centered on man. It's completely different. So, and this man-centered religion puts man first, and the God-centered religion puts God first. It's chalk and cheese. It's not mixable. So the new religion has to stamp out the old religion. And that's why, the new religion can tolerate Buddhism, Mohammedanism, Talmudism, Hinduism, you name it. And it does tolerate them in Vatican II, the documents of Vatican II. But the old religion it can't tolerate, because it's like a mathematics fair where you've got a brilliant new stall being set up, a 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 equals 5 stall. And there's 2 and 2 is 10, 2 and 2 is 20, 2 and 2 is 6, 2 and 2 is 6 million, but there's this 2 and 2 is 4 stall. Sooner or later, the 2 and 2 of 4 stall is going to put all the others out of business. So the Archbishop had to be put out of business. So he was constantly harassed during these years, during the 1980s, while the youngsters in the society the liberals were floating towards the top like scum, I'd have to say. I mean, I'd think of the comparison with scum, how scum floats to the top of the water. But it's not a very, let's say how cream floats to the top of milk. That's a little nicer. That's being nice. So anyway, because of course cream floats to the top of milk. Anyway, he was hammered during the 1980s, and he simply stood up to it and said, look, this is what the old religion says, this is what the new religion says. It's not compatible. This is not Catholicism. I want to die a Catholic, and I don't want to die a Protestant. He was unanswerable. They had to crush him, and they couldn't. They had to swallow him down, and they couldn't. He stuck in their throat.
As the Archbishop neared the end of his life, he conceived of Operation Survival in order to guarantee the continued ordination of traditional priests. Could you tell us why the Econe Episcopal consecrations of 1988 were necessary?
In 1988, he must have been 83. He was coming close to dying. He felt death coming, and he knew that if he didn't leave the society with bishops, the priests alone couldn't survive. The bishops are the pivot of the church. They are the ones that can make priests, or a bishop can consecrate bishops. But a priest can do neither. So without bishops, the society was doomed to die. So he said to Rome, look, I'm going to ordain bishops. Rome might have tolerated him if he'd not ordained consecrated bishops, because Rome knew, just as well as the Archbishop knew, that if he didn't leave bishops behind him, the society would die, and that all that Rome wanted was for the society to die, with all its seminaries, with all its priories. So what happened then was that there was negotiations were opened, and the Archbishop tried to get Rome to do its duty, to look after Catholic tradition. If Rome wants to also have all kinds of nonsense, that's Rome's problem, but Rome must at least also look after traditional Catholics, because that's the true faith. So Rome said, look, the Archbishop said, look, you've got to look up tradition. And Rome said, well, maybe you can join, we'll fix up a traditional committee, and you will have 3 members, and Rome will have 7, or some equivalent figures. In other words, Rome will dominate the operation, and you will not be able to stand up independently for tradition. You will be essentially under the control. Tradition will be essentially under the control of Rome. And the Archbishop said, I can't do that. If you won't give us bishops, I'm going to have to take them. Rome agreed in principle with 1 bishop, but the Archbishop knew that more were necessary. So he decided on 3, and then he added Bishop Foley, and that was a 4th. So there were 4 bishops he was going to consecrate. The day after the annual priestly ordinations, there would be the consecration of bishops. And there were 4 of us. I remember he gave us a brief retreat beforehand. And his presentation of the situation of the church was absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely accurate, just real. This is the reality. He didn't get worked up about it. He didn't get passionate. He wasn't worried. He just said, "This is how it is. This is the situation that you're going to face. This is what you're going to have to deal with, and here is how to deal with it." Don't ordain lightly, and so on and so on. He gave essential advice. So we were consecrated on the end of June 1988. And that, of course, precipitated excommunication by Rome. So, in theory, the Archbishop and Bishop de Castromaia, who at that point joined him, again, it was providential. There was one bishop who, after he retired, a Brazilian bishop, after he retired, felt free to be able to add his signature, the Archbishop's, on some of the Archbishop's documents, where the Archbishop attacked Rome for betraying the faith. And the second bishop added his signature. And then for the ceremony of the consecrations, Bishop de Castromaia came as well and attended, came all the way from Brazil. He's an old man also, like Archbishop Lefebvre, an old man. And he made all the journey to Econe. And he stood by the Archbishop's side at the ceremony, and he also laid hands on the bishops, which made sure of the validity, because in case the Archbishop was absent-minded for a moment, the other bishop would also, it guaranteed. And the Archbishop was very happy with that, with the presence of Bishop de Castromaia, because it was the proof that he wasn't just cooking the whole thing out of his own head. Bishop de Castromaia gave a brief but very good speech in which he said, I would have considered it a mortal sin if I had not come here to be at the Archbishop's side for this ceremony, because this is the religion I learnt, this is the religion I practiced, this is the religion that must survive. That's more or less what he said. And the Archbishop was very grateful. And the six of us, four new bishops, and the two old bishops, we were all of us excommunicated, in inverted commas. You look at canon law, it's not difficult to prove that it was invalid. An excommunication is either, by bell, book and candle, a formal ceremony, or automatic. Automatic according to canon law. Okay. Firstly, there was no formal ceremony. Secondly, according to canon law, it was not an excommunication that was the fitting punishment for what the Archbishop had done. That's easy to prove. Let's not go into it unless you wish. So the Archbishop again paid no attention to the excommunication. He was very happy because he no longer had to travel as a bishop and look after all of these ceremonies of confirmation and ordination all over the world. It was a great weight off his shoulders. He entrusted the society to a superior general, Father Schmidberger, who would not be a bishop, but who would be the superior general of the four bishops, and the four bishops who would confirm and ordain, above all, the two bishop sacraments all over the world, amongst the four of them, and so on. And the Archbishop said, I'm giving them no jurisdiction, I'm not setting up an emergency church, I'm simply setting up, so to speak, an emergency lighting system in the crisis of electricity, in the blackout of the faith. I'm setting up an emergency lighting system. So the four bishops were then on their own. 2.5 years later, the Archbishop died, a venerable death. And he saw and thought, I would say, more clearly than ever in those last 2.5 years, because he was no longer trying to play footsie with these criminal Romans. Criminal is not an exaggeration. They were betraying the faith. And God will have been giving them the graces to realize it, because they were and are, to this day, the real authority in the church. But they're not behaving like, they're not fulfilling the function of Catholic authority, which is to protect Catholic truth. They are betraying Catholic truth, and they must be knowing it. Because, for instance, the Pope Paul VI or John Paul II, they would have had little old ladies coming up to them and saying, Holiness, Holiness, my boy is in one of your seminaries and he's losing the faith. He's not just losing his vocation, he's losing the faith. The little old grandmother. They would have had graces like that. Authentic appeals of the genuine faith. And of course they just brushed it. They must have been brushing aside all of these definite graces. There must have been these graces. God is not abandoning his church, nor is he abandoning these felons He's trying to get them back to their senses before they die, so that they don't have to go to hell with a terrible eternity for having destroyed the church and destroyed and sent to hell millions of souls. God was trying to, but no, they just brush it aside. They aren't intellectuals, they don't understand. We understand the absolute need to fit together oil and water, and we're going to do it. Well, give it a try, but it won't work. And it hasn't worked. And all the time it's not working. The new religion is not working. It's just the evidence is piling in all the time. The old religion is in dead trouble because it hasn't got the authority that it needs. And therefore the old religion is falling into fragments all the time, but it's continuing. It may be fragmented, it may be unauthoritative, it may be not structured, it may be the resistance, as it's so called, or the fidelity, as they call it in France, may leave a great deal to be desired. Maybe a number of the priests do go crazy, like I could name a few, but I won't, because they haven't got a proper normal Catholic authority above their heads. They follow the truth, which is very good, but without that authority, they can't hold on to the truth. They go into sedevacantism or back into liberalism. So the resistance, quote unquote, may be a sorry affair, but it has to exist. It has, and it is existing, and God is maintaining it against all the odds. He's even maintaining the society to quite an extent, so that the society will be able to go on looking after a lot of souls who, without the society, if they had only the novice order, would lose the faith. So Almighty God, with a variety of, on the menu, you know, if anybody walks through into the Catholic restaurant, they find all the waiters and all the customers throwing custard pies at one another, but somewhere it's going to be the group of Catholics, or half Catholics or quarter Catholics, who are going to look after their faith. And the church is continuing. So, you know, you can say what you like about the faults of the SSPX, the faults of the resistance, the faults of... You say what you like. Humanly speaking, the Catholics are in real distress because they haven't got the authority that they need. God has given us back a voice of that authority from one who was once number 11 in the church, Archbishop Econe. And Archbishop Econe is telling it absolutely straight and absolutely clear. And he's not saying, oh, COVID is politics, we mustn't talk about politics, we're spiritual, spelt with two W's, spiritual. Oh, namby-pambies, that's what I would call them. And so, you know, the church today is in a mess. It's in a horrible mess. But Almighty God is making sure that it survives in this very unusual and un-Catholic way. But it is surviving. And it will be there, all of the waiters and customers throwing custard pies at another will be still there when he brings back authority, which he will do. I don't know when, you don't know when, none of us knows when. 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. Between now and then, there's going to be a huge chastisement. It surely can't be avoided any longer. But so that's the drama of the consecrations, and that's the beginning of the drama ever since the consecrations. The consecrations marked a real, you know, it was the mountaineers driving the piton into the rock, and that really held. It held for 20 years. Before it began to fall apart. But those 20 years were pretty good, were of expansion of the society again, more and more expansion. And by the end of those 20 years, let's say by then, that would put us into 2008 would be 20 years. By 2008, 2018, tradition was re-established, had its seat again in the church. It had been absolutely condemned by Paul VI. Paul VI pretended it was absolutely condemnable. John Paul II was maybe a little easier, but not much more favourable, and John Paul II was absolutely convinced of the new religion and happy with it. Benedict XVI is happy with the new religion, And he's another one that tried to fit things together. He and Bishop Williamson tried to put oil and water together in 2016? No, earlier, 2009. 2008, 2009, they were trying to put oil and water together. But then an idiot from England had been talking about the 6 million in Germany, and the bad guys ignited that bomb just at the right moment to stop Bishop Williamson and Benedict XVI.